Welcome to another session. Please do subscribe to the channel if you like being with me for reading and listening to this novel. Today it's from chapter 2, subchapter 3. The novel is at the moment called Letting Go, and the subchapter is called Mind the Gap. Manchester's skyline appeared before them. Even on the train, Feeny sat restlessly next to Renee, looking at the life rushing by outside the window, buildings, train stations, people. Would life rush by just as quickly for her now? To where? Just there, out of sight and out of mind? Mind the gap, please. Stand back. And the station has gone. Disappeared faster than it appeared. Renee grabbed her left hand and she took it from him. He reacted and kept his own on his own thighs. She did reach for his hand, hesitantly and uncertain. Looked outside through the window, away from him. Renee was undecided as to whether he should speak to her or not. The insecurity bore into him, as it obviously bore into her. They were on the same path and yet in very different worlds. She was on her way to the clinic to be informed of her oncologist's finding after the operation. She felt that he was just her healthy companion who was supposed to find out about his sick wife's findings. The distance would increase with a bad result. But even now, she could feel the distance between her world and his, the world of the affected and the world of the unaffected, which was already catapulted into infinity. 1 trillion kilometers difference between death and life, between a possible radically shortened lifespan and the usual life expectancy, between not living and surviving, between the end and they had talked about the time after death. Painful as it was, it sounded like dry theory. In this respect, she was sober and clear. For her, death was her death, her end, the end also of their relationship. You will look for a new relationship. You'll find a partner. Renee was offended by this immediacy. How can you say something like that when I'm fighting for you right now and doing everything I can to get through what you are going through? I need all my strength for the present. Tomorrow or the day after tomorrow is too much for me when I'm trying to cope just with the present. But perhaps she was right to think beyond death. Only he couldn't and wouldn't look that far. Tomorrow does not begin on the morning of the next day, not on the morning of the day after tomorrow, but as always, tomorrow began this morning. Renee had overslept in the morning because he hadn't been able to fall asleep the night before. He had been driven by fear of this morning, of today. Tomorrow and the day after tomorrow were the threat, but the shadows cast themselves over yesterday already, which appeared in a gloomy light in the blink of an eye. The train rushed into the next station from the overground into the artificially lit night. Time to get off. Feeny became even more nervous, looking at him for the first time, anxious, trying to lean on his strength. A big exception. Renee tried to endure her gaze, had no voice, no relieving explanation either, just wanted to endure with her. And in typical Feeny fashion, as soon as the train door cracked open, she looked at him with her winning smile as if she could and wanted to carry him. She must have sensed that he was lost, and so, as so often, she was more in control of herself than he was. Sorry, I didn't sleep well. I need a coffee first, he apologized. Starcups, he knew, was a place they both loved. Expensive to American too, but it offered something they could lose themselves in. A cappuccino with soy milk and caramel sauce, a good combination. Hard to get anywhere else. And above all, she loved her fidelity card, which earned her rewards points. She was proud when she got a free drink and was able to invite her husband. The children already knew when they set off on vacation in the morning or went for a hike that mum would be on the outlook for a cafe after a few corners and bends, and at the latest even before the actual start of the day. Passing a Starbucks in the morning without having had their special cappuccino was unthinkable. Grateful for a certain normality, Renee ordered a medium-sized cappuccino, which of course also went on her Fidelity account. She wanted to pay to show him how grateful she was to him for accompanying her that morning, and also because she was aware that today was about her. She felt it was an important moment in her life and also in the life of their relationship. On the other hand, it was just a medical consultation, but one that she went to with trepidation and hope at the same time. They sat down at one of the round coffee tables, and Feeny asked him what his research had revealed in the meantime. Sorry, but I don't have the energy to deal with this topic on the internet, she said, and reached for his hand. Over the last few days, I've searched through the various self-help groups, she added. It was terrible. I fell from one hole into another and could barely pull myself up by the scruff of my neck. It was like a bog into which I was sinking deeper and deeper. Strange, said Renee. I dreamt about Dartford Moor, that I was walking there with you, and suddenly I saw you step into one of those holes. You were submerging, sinking to your stomach, to your chest, to your chin. And I tried to reach out to you, reaching for you, your hands reaching for me, but we couldn't reach each other. It was the reverse image of the Sistine Chapel. Their hands touch, almost. But the impression is that the spark is ignited and moves from one hand to the other. At Dartmoor, no contact with you seemed possible. I stretched out with my last sinews. I stretched for your fine hair. It slipped away from me. I woke up in a sweat, only to be annoyed about myself by this insane dream when you were lying right next to me in bed, just slumbering and breathing softly. Excuse me, if I'm transferring my fears onto you. Both had said this sentence to each other almost simultaneously, and laughing at each other, Feeny grabbed his neck and gave him a kiss that made him taste the caramel flour. Shall we go? She asked calmly. Yes. Let's get going, he replied, grateful that they seemed to be on the same path. Across the street and around the corner, they reached the red brick building through the nondescript entrance into the small courtyard, which looked more like the front yard of a back building in Manchester. It was only because one of the doors that fronted this courtyard was open that they entered. No sign or indication, nor anyone else entering like them. The narrow staircase led upwards, which probably didn't surprise locals, because it was like those in thousands and thousands of terraced houses in England. Once on the second floor, Feeny and Rennie wondered how packed with sick-looking people a room could be. The room was furnished like a carnival in Mainz or Cologne, chairs of different styles, colors, and histories. Feeny thought that she landed in one of the retro markets with a jumble and hodgepodge of junked furniture. At the same time, the backyard room looked like a hospital from a black and white movie. Women with bald heads and headscarves, emaciated faces, black ink instead of eyebrows. Hardly any of the stripped chairs were free. At least there were no two chairs next to each other where they could have sat together. To register, they went to a narrow counter behind which sat two nurses. One of them wrote down Feeny's name and her date of birth, put a tick next to it, checked which of the doctors they had an appointment with, and told them to wait. It was not clear in which order they would be called. Feeny sat down on one of the few free chairs amongst the women, most of whom were decades older than she. René moved to a corner because, as the only man, he felt out of place and did not want to take another chair at the other end of the room, away from one of the women who were also waiting, standing up. Some huddled together, holding their lower bellies, some cried in pain, others bit their headscarves. Obviously, everyone was waiting to be called at some point to go to an examination, consultation, or the chemotherapy room. Still others sat there, hollow-eyed, hairless not only on their heads, but also over their skin, waiting silently. René was prepared to spend more time switching from one leg to the other, as they had already learned from the few hospital visits the children had made in Manchester that the NHS worked steadily but not hastily, unless there was an emergency. Feeny and he were therefore surprised when they were called after only about 30 minutes. Although the expectation was premature, they were not yet due to see the doctor. Feeny was only asked to stand on the scales with her clothes on, and her weight was noted by the attentive nurse on an oversized sheet of paper, which was then folded several times and filed in an orange folder. Feeny also answered various detailed questions from the friendly nurse, which she faithfully recorded in Feeny's patient file. The folder was still slim compared to the hundreds of patient folders that were stored on the shelves behind the nurses at the counter and, as could be seen through the open side door, also in the archive rooms. On the one hand, this sight reassured René. Women seemed to be able to hold out for quite a long time, given the partly bruised and big medical files of them. The question he asked himself was how long it would take to swell those file bellies. Feeny concentrated on the data so that it would be entered correctly in her file. His gaze wandered to the blackboard on the wall. There were obviously several oncologists seeing patients that morning. They were still quite early, but the board already showed delay times, different for each doctor. Feeny seemed to be privileged. While the average delay compared to the appointment was 90 to 130 minutes, Professor Lindemann was only 45 minutes late. But it did not escape his notice that after a few minutes, a nurse came in with a sponge and chalk to adjust the numbers to the progress. While a few numbers were reduced, hers grew from 45 minutes to 90 minutes. René didn't even want to think about what had caused such a jump. Patients, he thought, they are waiting in the waiting room and were not at the start of a race. In fact, women came and went. No men. He was still the only one. Probably in the wrong place in a consultation for ovarian cancer patients. It did not escape his eyes that Professor Lindemann's minute count would not increase any further for at least the next 45 minutes, which could mean, he calculated, that after they had already been waiting for more than 90 minutes, Feeny would soon be called. The details, however, he learned that morning were approximations at best, written down to reduce expectations rather than raise hopes. Feeny gave him an encouraging look, stood up, approached him, and asked him if he would like to swap places with her. She had been sitting for so long that she would like to stand for once. René had understood that she wanted to do something good for him. He accepted her offer, not only so as not to reject her, but also because his legs were starting to hurt. And he also replied that he had just needed to rest a little. There were still a few chairs free, but she had understood that he would feel very uncomfortable sitting in a patient's chair. After his thighs had recovered somewhat, they changed places again. The number of minutes Professor Lindemann had waited had not further increased, despite some changes behind other names on the tableau. They were already about 40 minutes over the 90-minute mark, but what do minutes mean in a lifetime of years? His somewhat doubtful look at the next table correction to the nurse, who was trying to get the numbers right, was answered with a kind look. She stepped up to him and whispered in his ear that Professor Lindemann had put a lunch break in between. But they were the next in line, so it would only take a few more minutes. René thanked her warmly for the encouraging interim information, but didn't know whether it would also be a relief for Feeny. Feeny, on the other hand, had become quiet. She had long since opened her laptop on her thighs and was busily typing away. There was no internet in the room and no power socket for computers, but Feeny's device was younger and better equipped than his. She had bought the latest generation and could work both with and without the cloud. René was dozing a little while standing and had told her in between that they were obviously one of the next to have their turn. She had hardly listened, but was completely absorbed in her text. Admirable, he thought. And would I have the nerve and concentration to focus on my numbers before going to the executioner? Or was I reading the situation wrong? In any case, Feeny radiated optimism, which Reno could not share, although he would have liked to. She typed. Was it a redemptive message when the nurse approached Feeny and told her that the professor was waiting for her in his meeting room? Feeny looked up to René optimistically, folded up her laptop, packed it into her almost oversized handbag, and marched off with René. They followed the nurse to Professor Lindemann's small office. The oncologist was not alone in this meeting room. A nurse was sitting at his side. And the nurse had explained on the way that the protocol stipulated that even if a patient was accompanied by her husband, the oncologist must always have a nurse at his side. Who was more tense, René or Feeny? They both sat on pins and needles after Professor Lindemann offered them 2 chairs in front of his desk. He briefly introduced himself and asked if they were originally from Germany. Yes, said Feeny cautiously and openly. And you're married? Yes, since 1992. And we have 2 children, Jan and Alina, since 1998 and 2001, respectively. What do you do for a living? He asked. I studied fashion and interior design in Munich and now run a business here and there, replied Feeny, and my husband is self-employed. Oh, came out of Professor Lindemann's mouth. You know a lot about art and culture. I was born in Austria, even though I've forgotten almost all my German. My father was a historian, an art historian, for the 19th and early 20th centuries. To be precise, until the Nazis drove him from his chair. His parents were Jewish, and he was lucky enough to escape to England with his wife. Above my bed, I remember, hung a painting by a little-known Jewish artist in exile, Yusuf Abu, and next to it, another by the later more famous Kokoschka. I have little to do with fashion, but my daughter works in the fashion industry, so every now and then I have to give my opinion on advertising campaigns that she has to design online, even though I really don't know much about it. But then Lainey says she wants an independent opinion, and that is really what I can give her. And you, Mr. Weingarten, in which industry are you self-employed? René was surprised that the doctor was interested in their professional activities. I've been an entrepreneur for years. I try to see gaps and find solutions to problems. I build teams and companies on this and try to release them into independence at the right time and implement a new idea with what they have achieved. For the last few months, I've been developing private nurseries in Manchester with a partner in a small team, of which there are far too few in the city, and the few, including state-run ones, are, in our opinion, overpriced. Professor Lindemann listened attentively. You're pursuing an important task, he said, because our nurses and other employees are constantly looking for nursery places and afternoon care, usually in vain. Feeny listened, relaxed, and had almost forgotten that she was sitting in front of her new oncologist, who was to explain the findings of her illness to her. However, he soon got down to business. Slightly absorbed in the papers, but without ignoring the patient and her husband, he lifted up. I've studied the surgical report and also looked at the cytological findings. The picture that emerges from both seems ambiguous to me, but let me explain a little more. Feeny had obviously only heard the two words, not clear, and grimaced. She later explained to Rini that she was no longer able to mentally absorb what followed, that she had heard the doctor's words but barely understood them. She wanted to know whether René had managed to follow and the explanations and explain them to her. During the operation, which lasted several hours, Professor Lindemann continued, the main focus of the tumor was removed. However, it had already embedded itself in the peritoneum and was so firmly attached to it that the larger part of the peritoneum has had to be removed, together with your two ovaries, as we already suspected and were told during the consultation, but also with the uterus and the uterine canal. As you can imagine, this was a major operation that will have some immediate consequences. Even if we give you medication to alleviate the symptoms, you may soon experience severe signs of premature menopause. As soon as they have regained their strength, and you as a body, we will start chemotherapy, which is when most women lose their hair. Renee could see from the look on Feeny's face that she had been unable to follow this conversation. I'm worried about the metastasis of the tumor, he continued, that was found in one of the lymph nodes, which is not dramatic, but indicates that the tumor has crossed the threshold of the abdominal cavity and is beginning to spread into the body. However, he added, not wanting to end the bad news without a positive outlook, we have looked at all the other organs, also checked them again in an MRI scan, and this seems to be the only metastasis. After René, as a layman, had previously done some research on the internet about prognoses, which are essentially based on the classification of ovarian disease, he asked for clarification of the message. Does this relocation mean that my wife is no longer stage 1 or 2? Unfortunately, yes. That is what it means, Professor Lindemann replied openly and honestly, also keeping an eye on Feeny, who was fully awake again at that moment. The assessment in the surgical report, continued Professor Lindemann, is that your wife is stage 3, according to the worldwide table. Feeny's expression turned pale, and she seemed to collapse in her chair. But you know, Professor Lindemann said, with some pathos in his voice, stages are not a clear measure. I've had and still have patients who come out of surgery with stage 1 and still have a severe further course of their disease. Just a second. Sorry. Let me just repeat this one passage because I have a problem with my laptop accu. Yeah. I have had and still have patients who come out of surgery with stage 1 and still have a severe further course of their disease. And then I have a number of women who, like them, have stage 3 or even stage 4 for a long time. Or to put it another way, the open truth is that while the majority of breast cancers are curable today, ovarian cancer can only rarely be cured. You have to accept that you will die from this disease or its side effects. To die. There it was, the death sentence. As if these words could resonate in a room. They grew like a wall and struck both those standing in front of her. An awkward silence fell. The 4 people in the small room stared into a toxic void. As harsh as these words were, Professor Lindemann was not yet at the end of his report. What also worries me, and I can't quite explain, is the cytological finding. Of course, we know that our categorization of cancer is still a very rough one. The cell structures that the laboratory examined cannot be clearly interpreted. We are familiar with the phenomenon of mixed forms of deviant cells. We're not only dealing with a specifically altered cell structure, but can have mixtures of different cell changes. In your case, parts of the findings suggest a high-grade carcinoma. Other foci resemble a mesothelioma, but could also be an expression of a low-grade carcinoma. We will have to wait for further samples and wait to see the further course of the disease, especially the reaction to the therapy. René, who tried to follow Professor Lindemann's explanations attentively, thought they sounded like Bulgarian. They were foreign terms to him. He didn't realize the implications of what this scientist was saying out loud. What should the therapy look like and what chances of success do you see? Asked René, feeling naive. As we suspected before the operation, first, your wife has to recover from the surgery for a few more days. Then we should consider the following together. The treatment recommended worldwide in this case consists of 6 cycles of carboplatin and paclitaxel, which are administered here at the hospital at 3-week intervals. However, we are not part of an ICON 8 study, and we could join it, which I'm co-responsible for, which gives this therapy at a lower dose, but not every 3 weeks, but every week. The preliminary studies have shown that toxicity, it is the risk of dangerous side effects, can be reduced by the lower dosage with more frequent administration. For you, this means that the risk of having to discontinue the therapy because the body reacts too violently with side effects is lower. And overall, according to the preliminary results, the effectiveness of the therapy even appears to be slightly increased. But I want to leave the choice up to you, because it is a study, and we cannot yet know whether the preliminary assumptions will be confirmed in a larger number of women. In addition, I have to admit the study is a randomized study, so I can't even promise you whether your wife will benefit from the new form of therapy or whether she will be placed in the comparison group that follows the traditional therapy plan. René sensed that a decision was needed, even if he did not quite know how to decide. Feeny had barely been able to follow the conversation, so he looked at her. And even before he could tell from her expression which way she was leaning, she surprisingly spoke up. I want to try that, was her answer. It's more time-consuming if I have to go to hospital every week, but on the other hand, I can organize my commitments and events better on a weekly basis than if 2 weeks were normal and the third week was different. And the question of compatibility doesn't seem insignificant to me either, René added. Professor Lindemann confirmed that he would have recommended the same decision if Feeny were his wife, and if she had been the one affected. He reached for a pad in front of him and wrote the corresponding prescription, handed it over to Feeny and asked her, "Please give this to the nurses at reception. They will tell you when the chemotherapy is due to start, and they will also have to enter you on the study form. Please then attend the appointment with our Macmillan nurses. They will give you more information about the possible side effects, especially your hair loss. This is one of the unpleasant, though not threatening, side effects. Some of my patients wear individual headscarves. Others have wigs made, which are also paid for by the NHS. It depends on how they want to and are able to deal with this confrontation with their illness and therapy, which is certainly drastic for you." Feeny swallowed, René no less. It only just dawned on them what this first step towards therapy would mean. I also noted on the prescription that we would see each other again in 8 weeks to see how the therapy is working. Professor Lindemann gave them an encouraging look, even though he knew he had had bad news to deliver. He had taken a lot of time for them, and René guessed why the nurse had to adjust the chart upwards so often. But he also realized that such a conversation could not be forced into the time slots that the NHS had planned. And he was a little annoyed at his previous impatience. If he had had any further questions, they would have been answered by Professor Lindemann. At no point during the entire conversation had he given the impression that they were under any time pressure. Before saying goodbye, Professor Lindemann turned to Feeny again and reached under her arm to move her towards the couch. "May I still examine you?" he asked. "I would like to see the abdominal wound and also palpate your stomach." "Yes," Feeny was completely back to herself. "You can undress behind this curtain." The nurse present helped her. The two men stood on this side of the screen until René's wife, clad only in her knickers, approached the couch in front of which the gynecological chair stood. "Please lie down on the couch, very flat, and try to relax and breathe normally." Professor Lindemann approached her, took René with him, and carefully felt Feeny's stomach wound. "Look how well the wound has healed," he said. René was rather speechless because he had not yet seen the full length of his wife's wound, which had been tightly bandaged since the operation. She had indicated it to him in the semi-darkness during a bandage change, but now he saw the abdominal incision in bright light, in the full lightening of the examination room. The incision ran from just above her vagina, across the entire abdominal cavity to below the rib cage. The sutures were reddish in color, but the skin, which Professor Lindemann pointed out to him, looked inconspicuous in his opinion. Professor Lindemann moved the skin slightly back and forth with his hand and fingers, feeling for the underlying tissue, moving it to the right and left too. At least he didn't seem dissatisfied with his surgical colleague's operation. Feeny lay on the couch without making a face. "You will soon be able to carry light things again," he said, "even go on longer walks, so I think we can start therapy sooner than we thought." Feeny didn't dare to tell Professor Lindemann that she had already made a trip from Manchester to Munich and back. The oncologist went to his small desk, corrected the date on the prescription, and pressed it into René's hand. Feeny got dressed behind the screen. They thanked him, and Professor Lindemann not only accompanied them outside, but also took them around a few corners back to the room where they had been waiting for the appointment with him some time before. The nurses looked at the two of them and at their boss, took the prescription, and before the next appointment was entered in the calendar, Professor Lindemann put his hand on Feeny's shoulder, looked at her, and René said goodbye. I will do my best, he said, and I'm certain that the road ahead is not an easy one. Thank you, was Feeny's reply. She looked after him, turned to the nurse, took her laptop and made a note of the date of the first chemotherapy and the follow-up appointments. Feeny and René moved silently towards the stairs. First steps after a death sentence. First steps into an uncertain future, whose length, or rather brevity, was even more uncertain than that of a so-called normal life. Down across the small courtyard to the street. There the world seemed to have taken its course without anything having changed. Feeny and René looked into an environment that had become alien to them. How the world can change completely in seconds, through findings and dates, appointments and plans, and not even for everyone else. They went to the same cafe they had visited before the appointment, but at first just looked at each other in puzzlement. Life seemed to be divided into two, into a time before and another time after, into a time of hope and hopelessness, of denial and incomprehensibility, a time of multiple examinations, blood tests, CT scans, tumor markers, and all the other unknown abbreviations and terms they had not known and had to learn, and a time when it all seemed to have melted into one single message. Ovarian cancer, stage 3. You know, Feeny pulled herself together a little. I told someone a few days ago that I might be in the early stages, maybe stage 2, and I thought that was an overly cautious threat, and now I'm 3. She couldn't continue. Her voice broke and she shook her head in bewilderment. René's answer stuck in his throat. After a few minutes of shared silence, she looked at him, stood up and asked, "Do you want a cappuccino too?" He couldn't speak yet and indicated his agreement with a silent nod. First, he had to take a deep breath and realize what had just happened. He had understood that the illness was much, much more serious than either of them had even dared to imagine. Out of the blue, Feeny and he not only were fallen to earth, the earth had suddenly opened up like a crack in the ground, and Feeny and he seemed to be in free fall. Hold, the therapy, the study, they had no idea because they hadn't thought that far ahead and had never been suspended in an air of life with no net beneath, like they were at that moment. What was the name of the study? Feeny came back with the cappuccinos, and René wanted to be there for her, not dwell on his terrible thoughts. His smile sounded a little forced. First of all, I can have another coffee, she continued. But I just want to thank you. Thank you for being with me. You know, when everything comes at me like that, I can't keep up. I want to hear, but it just rushes in my ears and past my ears. Then other sounds come to me, combined with images, horrible images and sounds that condense into noise. Everything goes horribly black around me and I can no longer grasp anything. I'm then isolated from what is happening outside. What's more, I've been determined not to look at the internet for the past few days. The experience reports only fuel more uncertainty in me, let fear creep up in me. They sound either hollow and empty or unrealistic. Can you do that for me? Google the study? I will, said Renee. Let me do some research first. You can make the appointment with Macmillan. I'm available every day this week anyway. Then we'll see. Right, said Feeny. Let's finish our drinks slowly because we have to get back. In the meantime, Alina and Jan had returned from their host parents and school respectively. You have to pick Alina up from school. Jan is away with the school orchestra. He won't be back until the end of the next week. Indeed, said Renee after checking the time on his cell phone. What a day, he thought to himself, as he sat alone in the car, breathing a sigh of relief to pick Alina up from her school. Naturally, Alina wanted to know how the meeting at the hospital had gone. She asked how Mom was doing, and in the evening, Jan called. He also wanted to know how Mamuchka was doing and how seriously ill she was. He had probably learned from conversations with his friends or from the internet that there were different clinical pictures that had a bearing on the question of life expectancy. Alina was more interested in her mother's condition. She wanted to understand the disease and the outlook better. As a result, Renee had two very different journeys. One from Alina and the other on the phone. Mum is a bit depressed, he began with Alina. She had hoped that the operation had gone well, and it seemed that way because she had recovered relatively quickly. But, Alina interrupted him, anxious and demanding. Yes, your doctor explained to us that the disease was a little more advanced than we thought and would have liked. Does Mann have to die now? She asked from the back seat. She'd probably die of this disease, Renee said calmly, but also cuttingly determined. And he looked into the mirror. Stifling a cry, thick tears worked their way down both her cheeks. However, he wanted to reduce the distance that his rational, factual information had created. That won't be today, not tomorrow, not even the day after tomorrow. The doctor had said she would live for years to come, and we will have her for a long time. So we don't need to be worried just yet. Renee said no less calmly and no less firmly than before. Was this the beginning of her dying process? Was he keeping his emotions at bay in solidarity with Feeny like she was? Which side was he on? Closer to dying or closer to believing in living? And so more and more worries and fear arose in him. He pulled over, parked the car at the next dip in the road, got out, sat with Alina in the back seat, grabbed both her hands and held them to his chest, then hugged her and laid her head against him. He ran his hands through her hair and felt his shirt getting damp and wetter as his own tears wet her hair. He couldn't remember how long they sat together like that, only that at some point they looked at each other and were startled. Now, she no longer was an 8-year-old. At least that's how he saw her now. She had probably understood that the roles had just been reversed. She was no longer allowed to expect everything from Mum in a childlike attitude. With a firm look, she signaled to Renee that she had now suddenly become the adult that Mum had to be. And so she wanted to step up to Mum, no longer to show her her own fear, but to help her bear what she was coming to. And Renee sensed that this might overwhelm her. You said, Dad, she won't die today or tomorrow. Yes, that's what the doctor told us. Dad, we mustn't scare Mum, even if I have a tummy ache, said Alina. Come on, drive, Dad, she added. I want to take Mum in my arms. Yes, let's take her in our arms, Renee confirmed. Mum is big and strong, was her final verdict before Renee got behind the wheel and they set off determinedly on the last few kilometers home. When they arrived home, Renee parked the car, brought Alina into the house, put down her school bag, while she had already rushed into the living room and snuggled up close to Mum on the sofa. Feeny had wrapped her arm tightly around her and held her close. Alina kissed her, hugged her, without tears, very warmly and intimately. Mum, it's going to be okay. I love you so much, she told her. I love you so much. Feeny couldn't answer. Hugged her all the more intimately, stroking her head and back. Then she took a deep breath. Has Dad told you yet? Mum, I love you, was the reply, nodding. Oh dear, it's so bad, said Feeny. Mum, we have each other. I won't let you go. Feeny was moved, and Alina wiped the tears from her cheeks with her hair. Feeny looked at Renee questioningly. We are together, he said. Yes, Feeny added briefly. Thanks for joining me for this chapter and subchapter. And there will be another one tomorrow morning. Thank you very much.